A millionaire marries an obese maid as a bet, but what she does after leaves him speechless. At first, it's all a cruel joke, a rich man proving his power in front of his laughing friends. But when the vows are spoken, something no one expected happens. Her innocent young son looks up at him and whispers, "Mommy says you're my daddy." Now the game is over, and the truth changes everything. The marriage meant for mockery turns into a battle of pride, faith, and family. She carries scars of years of rejection, but also a strength that could break through his cold heart. As secrets rise and betrayals come to light, the stakes climb higher than money or reputation. It's about redemption, love, and the fight for a little boy's future. But here's the question everyone's asking. Can a man who married her as a bet ever truly win her heart? Or has he already lost the only family he never knew he had? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across Charles Whitmore's grand ballroom, where the elite of society gathered in their finest attire. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the subtle notes of $1,000 wines. In one corner, Clara Johnson moved quietly between the guests, her plain black uniform a stark contrast to the glittering evening gowns and crisp tuxedos surrounding her. Charles, old sport, called out Harrison Wellington, swirling his red wine with exaggerated flair. "Your new maid seems to be cleaning up quite efficiently." His voice carried just enough to ensure others would hear. "Though she might want to lay off sampling the olives." Laughter rippled through the small group of men. Clara kept her eyes down, focusing on gathering empty glasses onto her silver tray, her cheeks burning but her movements steady and dignified. "I don't know how you do it, Whitmore," chimed in Bradley Peters, his bow tie slightly askew from too many drinks. "Having someone so substantial moving about your beautiful home. Doesn't it rather spoil the aesthetic?" Charles Whitmore adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a hint of annoyance crossing his features. Not at the cruel remarks, but at the implicit criticism of his choices as a host and homeowner. "She's perfectly adequate at her job," he said dismissively. "Adequate?" Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "My dear fellow, since when does Charles Whitmore settle for adequate? You're losing your edge. Next thing we know, you'll be telling us you're in love with her." The group erupted in raucous laughter again. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reached for another empty glass, catching fragments of their conversation despite her best efforts to shut it out. "Perhaps our Charles has gone soft," suggested another guest, raising his glass in mock toast. The great bachelor tamed at last by his maid, no less. Charles's jaw tightened, his pride stung by their taunts. He was Charles Whitmore, after all, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who commanded respect in every boardroom in the city. He wouldn't be mocked in his own home. "You think I'm soft?" Charles's voice cut through the laughter like steel. "I could marry her tomorrow if I wanted to. It would be the simplest thing in the world." "Oh, really?" Harrison leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "Care to make it interesting? I'll marry her. Watch me." Charles's words rang out clear and cold. It would be child's play. The room exploded with laughter and excited chatter, the wealthy men clapping and calling out suggestions for the terms of the bet. Clara, who had been passing nearby with her tray, felt her heart plummet to her stomach. The glasses clinked softly as her hands shook, but she forced herself to keep moving, to keep her face neutral. Charles stood in the center of his admirers, a satisfied smirk playing across his features as he accepted their congratulations on his daring proposition. He was already planning how to execute this latest game, seeing it as nothing more than another business transaction to be won. Meanwhile, Clara slipped quietly into the pantry, setting down her tray of glasses with trembling hands. In the dim light, surrounded by shelves of fine china and crystal, she closed her eyes and folded her hands. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please give me strength. Help me face whatever comes with grace and dignity." A single tear rolled down her cheek as she continued her silent prayer, seeking comfort in her faith while Charles's cruel laughter still echoed from the ballroom. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Whitmore mansion as Clara arrived for work, her steps hesitant but her head held high. Her navy uniform felt like armor as she braced herself for what might come after last night's overheard conversation. The kitchen bustled with its usual morning activity, the cook preparing breakfast, maids organizing serving trays, the soft clink of china against silver. Suddenly, Charles Whitmore's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he entered the kitchen. The staff froze, unused to seeing him in this domain so early. His expensive suit seemed out of place among the practical work clothes of the household staff. "Clara," he called out, his voice carrying the theatrical warmth that made her stomach clench. "Just the person I wanted to see." He strode toward her, a practiced smile on his face. The other staff members stopped their tasks, watching with wide eyes as Charles dropped to one knee before Clara. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "My dear Clara," he announced loudly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Gasps echoed through the kitchen. The cook dropped a spoon with a clatter. Clara's hands trembled as she looked down at Charles's smirking face, seeing the mockery beneath his charm. "No," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I would not." She turned and walked quickly from the kitchen, ignoring the whispers that followed her throughout the morning. As Clara went about her duties, she couldn't shake the proposal from her mind. In quiet moments, she thought of Ethan, her precious 7-year-old son, waiting at their small apartment. She thought of their struggling budget, of the nights she lay awake wondering how to afford his school supplies. She remembered his birthday wish for a new bicycle that she couldn't provide. In the afternoon chapel of the mansion, where she sometimes went to dust the pews, Clara sat down and closed her eyes in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "give me wisdom. Show me the path." As she sat in the peaceful quiet, she thought about what this marriage could mean: security for Ethan, a better education, a stable home. Perhaps this was God's way of answering her prayers, even if it came wrapped in an unexpected package. That evening, Charles sat in his study, smugly signing marriage papers his lawyer had rushed to prepare. He chuckled to himself, imagining his friend's reactions to his joke. The fountain pen scratched across the expensive paper as he signed with flourish. Meanwhile, Clara walked slowly up the stairs to her apartment, tears gathering in her eyes. She would tell Ethan tonight, not about the cruel bet or the mockery, but about how sometimes courage meant making difficult choices for those we love. Courthouse's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the small gathering in the civil ceremony room. The space, with its plain wooden benches and faded American flag, felt worlds away from Charles Whitmore's usual elegant surroundings. His friends, dressed in expensive suits that seemed out of place in the modest setting, huddled near the back, barely containing their snickers. Clara stood at the front, wearing a simple cream-colored dress that she'd carefully pressed the night before. Her sister Sarah beamed with pride beside her, while 7-year-old Ethan clung to the fabric of his mother's skirt, his small fingers wrapped tightly in the soft material. His Sunday best suit, though slightly too big, had been lovingly altered by Clara herself. The judge, a kind-faced older woman, began the ceremony with practiced efficiency. When it came time for the vows, Charles delivered his with mechanical precision, his voice carrying just a hint of amusement that made Clara's sister frown. Then it was Clara's turn. She took a deep breath, her voice soft but clear as she spoke from her heart. "Charles, I stand here today not because of wealth or status, but because I believe in the power of love to change hearts. I promise to be patient and kind, to support you in times of trouble, and to always show you the grace that God has shown me. I vow to build a home filled with warmth, understanding, and forgiveness." Charles's smirk faltered. Something in Clara's genuine words pierced through his carefully maintained facade. He hadn't expected sincerity. He hadn't expected her eyes to shine with such gentle determination. For a brief moment, his fingers trembled as he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. Ethan watched the entire ceremony with wide-eyed wonder, his innocent face turned up toward the adults who were becoming, in his young mind, a real family. The child's presence made it impossible for Charles to fully enjoy his cruel joke. After the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the small group began to disperse. Charles's friends clapped him on the back, their laughter now seeming hollow in the face of Clara's dignity. As they headed toward the door, Ethan suddenly let go of his mother's hand and rushed over to Charles. The little boy tugged on Charles's sleeve, causing him to look down. With all the innocence of childhood, Ethan whispered words that stopped Charles cold. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Charles stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the implications hit him. His eyes darted to Clara, who had gone pale, her face flushing with quiet dread. The simple courthouse hallway suddenly felt airless as the truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. That evening, the vast emptiness of Charles's mansion seemed to echo with unspoken accusations. He found Clara in the kitchen, methodically unpacking a small box of her belongings. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if each plate she placed in the cupboard was a shield between them. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" Charles's voice cracked with barely contained anger. "Were you ever going to tell me about Ethan?" Clara's hands stilled on a worn coffee mug. She turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "You mean like how you told your friends about your cruel bet? The one where marrying me was just a joke?" Charles flinched at her words, but pressed on. "That's different. This is about my son." "Your son?" Clara's laugh was bitter. 7 years ago, you were too busy climbing the social ladder to notice the quiet girl who served your drinks. But yes, we had a brief romance. Do you even remember? Charles's face paled as fragments of memories surfaced. Stolen kisses in darkened hallways. Whispered promises he never meant to keep. "Why didn't you tell me when you found out?" "Tell you?" Clara's voice trembled. "The man who dropped me without a word when his friends started asking questions? The man who couldn't bear to be seen with someone who didn't fit his perfect image." She squared her shoulders. "You were arrogant and cruel, Charles. I chose to protect my child from that." The weight of his past actions crashed down on Charles. The bet that had seemed so clever now felt like a trap of his own making. All his carefully laid plans were unraveling, revealing truths he wasn't prepared to face. Clara's next words cut through his thoughts like ice. "You wanted to marry me as a joke? Fine, but this joke is your son's life." Charles stumbled backward, his hand finding the kitchen counter for support. His eyes landed on a piece of paper on the table, one of Ethan's drawings. 3 stick figures stood hand in hand, crude but unmistakable in their meaning, a family. Mother, father, son. Without another word, Charles turned and fled to his study, the drawing clutched in his trembling hand. He slumped into his leather chair, staring at the childish artwork that now seemed to mock everything he thought he knew about his life. Stick figures smiled up at him with simple black lines, representing a happiness he had never considered possible or deserved. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Clara moved efficiently around the space, the familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation, bringing comfort after a night of restless thoughts. The sizzle of bacon and warm aroma of coffee filled the air, while 7-year-old Ethan sat at the counter, swinging his legs and chattering excitedly. And then Mrs. Peterson said, "We're going to have a science fair next week." "Can I make a volcano, Mom? Jimmy made one last year, and it was so cool." Ethan's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Clara smiled warmly, sliding scrambled eggs onto his plate. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll get the supplies this weekend." Heavy footsteps in the doorway made them both look up. Charles stood awkwardly at the threshold, his usual confident demeanor notably absent. He wore an expensive suit, but seemed unsure where to place himself in this domestic scene. "Good morning, Daddy," Ethan called out cheerfully, the word making Charles visibly flinch. Clara gestured to the empty chair. "Would you like some breakfast, Charles?" He nodded stiffly and sat down, maintaining a careful distance from Ethan. Clara placed a plate before him, her movements graceful despite her size. Charles watched as she packed Ethan's lunch, adding a small note and making the boy giggle when she kissed his forehead. Throughout the day, Charles found himself distracted during meetings, his mind wandering to the morning scene. He observed Clara through new eyes as she managed the household with quiet efficiency. Never complaining about the dual role of wife and housekeeper, she still maintained. Her dignity in the face of whispers from other staff members made his chest tighten uncomfortably. When Ethan returned from school, he ran straight to Charles's study, proudly showing him a perfect spelling test. "Look what I got, Daddy." The pure trust in the boy's eyes made Charles's throat constrict. That evening, Charles's phone rang. His friend Marcus's booming voice filled the line. "Charles, you old dog. How's life with your maid wife?" Raucous laughter echoed through the speaker as other voices joined in. "Did she clean your bedroom before or after the honeymoon?" Someone jeered. Charles forced a laugh, but it felt hollow. "Very funny, guys. Seriously though," Marcus continued, "how long are you going to keep up this charade? The joke's getting a bit old, isn't it?" In the hallway, Clara froze, a stack of fresh towels in her arms. Each word struck like a physical blow. She watched Charles through the partially open door as he chuckled weakly at another crude joke. Quietly retreating to her room, Clara sank to her knees beside the bed. A tear rolled down her cheek as she clasped her hands together. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "please soften Charles's heart. Help him see beyond appearances to the love that could be. Give me strength to endure, and show him the way to be the father and husband I know he can become. Amen." Clara parked her modest sedan in front of St. Mary's Community Center, the weathered brick building standing as a testament to years of service to the neighborhood's less fortunate. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his designer suit, clearly out of his element as he watched homeless individuals already lining up outside. "We come here every Saturday," Clara explained softly, helping Ethan unbuckle his seatbelt. "Everyone here is family." Charles followed them inside, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. The familiar faces greeted Clara with warm smiles and respectful nods. "Miss Clara." "Thank goodness you're here," called out Martha, an elderly volunteer with silver hair. "And you brought little Ethan, and oh." She paused, noticing Charles. "Your husband too?" Clara's cheeks flushed slightly as she tied on her apron. "Yes, Charles wanted to join us today. It wasn't entirely true, she had insisted he come. But she wouldn't embarrass him by saying so. Charles stood awkwardly to the side while Clara and Ethan fell into their routine. He watched as Clara ladled steaming soup into bowls, greeting each person by name, asking about their week, their health, their struggles. Her genuine concern touched something deep inside him he thought he'd buried long ago. "Would you like to help, Daddy?" Ethan's innocent voice startled Charles from his thoughts. The boy held out a small apron, his eyes shining with hope. Charles hesitated, then nodded, allowing his son to help tie it around his waist. Together, they worked the bread station, Ethan chattering happily as he handed out rolls while Charles made sure each tray had enough. He couldn't help but notice how his son seemed to light up the room, bringing smiles to weary faces. "Your boy's got a beautiful heart," an old man commented to Charles as he shuffled past. "Just like his mama." Charles watched Clara comforting a young mother with a crying baby, saw how she slipped an extra portion onto the plate of a thin teenager trying to hide his hunger. The respect these people showed her wasn't born from fear or wealth. It came from genuine love and gratitude. For the first time, Charles saw his wife and son as they truly were, not as parts of some cruel joke or social experiment. but as beautiful souls, making the world better through simple acts of kindness. The sight of them working together, Ethan's laughter mixing with Clara's gentle voice, created a picture of family he'd never known he wanted. Later that evening, they settled onto the couch to watch television. The day's activities had worn Ethan out, and his small body gradually slumped against Charles's side. Before long, soft snores indicated he had fallen asleep, his head resting trustingly on his father's shoulder. Charles looked down at his son's peaceful face, his heart twisting with unfamiliar emotions. Pride, shame, longing, and something warmer all battled within him as he watched Ethan sleep. The cruel bet that had started. All this seemed suddenly hollow and meaningless compared to the weight of his sleeping child against his side. The private dining room at LeBlanc buzzed with the familiar sound of expensive watches clinking against crystal wine glasses. Charles sat at his usual spot, surrounded by his longtime friends, investment bankers and corporate lawyers who had been part of his social circle for years. "So how's married life treating you, old sport?" James Thompson smirked, swirling his aged bourbon. "Still playing house with the help?" The others chuckled, their designer suits rustling as they leaned forward eagerly for Charles's response. These lunch meetings had become a ritual of mockery since his wedding to Clara. "You know, Charles," Richard Martinez cut in, "you've more than proved your point. Won the bet fair and square. Why keep up the charade?" Charles stared into his untouched glass of wine, remembering Ethan's smile that morning over breakfast. The boy had proudly shown him a perfect spelling test score. "Actually, I've been thinking," Charles began, but Peter Anderson interrupted. "Look, just divorce her already," Peter said, rolling his eyes. "Write her a nice check and we can all laugh about this over drinks at the club. It's getting a bit old, don't you think?" For the first time since these lunches began, Charles felt no urge to join in their laughter. Instead, a knot formed in his stomach as he recalled Clara's quiet dignity while serving at the soup kitchen last weekend. "I should go," Charles said abruptly, standing up. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor, drawing surprised looks from his friends. "Come on, Charles, lighten up," James called after him. "It was just a joke." But Charles was already walking away, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor as he left. Their words echoed in his head, sounding hollow and cruel in a way they never had before. Drive home took longer than usual as Charles wrestled with his thoughts. When had their humor started feeling so mean-spirited? Or had it always been this way, and he was only now noticing? Pulling into his driveway, Charles sat in his car for a moment, gathering himself. Through the living room window, he could see Clara and Ethan at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks and papers. Entering quietly, he watched as Clara patiently explained a math problem to Ethan. Her voice was gentle but firm as she guided him through each step, never showing frustration when he struggled to understand. "That's it," Clara encouraged when Ethan finally solved the problem. "See? I knew you could do it." The pure joy on Ethan's face as he mastered the concept made Charles's throat tighten. He thought about his friends' arrogant laughter at the restaurant, their casual cruelty, and felt a wave of shame wash over him. The contrast between Clara's patient kindness and his friends' mockery was stark and undeniable. Standing there in the doorway, Charles realized he no longer recognized the man who had made that cruel bet. More importantly, he wasn't sure he wanted to be that man anymore. The weekend sun painted Golden Gate Park in warm autumn colors as Charles, Clara, and Ethan made their way along the winding path. The playground ahead buzzed with the happy shrieks of children, and Ethan's eyes lit up at the sight of the empty swings. "Push me, Daddy." "Please?" Ethan tugged at Charles's sleeve, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Charles hesitated, glancing at the swing set uncertainly. In all his 42 years, he'd never pushed a child on a swing before. "I'm not sure it's easy." Ethan was already racing toward the swings, his sneakers kicking up wood chips as he ran. Clara gave Charles a gentle nudge. "Go on, He's been wanting to do this with you all week." Clearing his throat, Charles followed Ethan to the swings. The boy had already climbed onto the black rubber seat, his small hands gripping the chains tightly. Charles stood behind him, awkwardly placing his hands on the swing sides. "You have to push harder," Ethan called out as Charles gave a tentative push. "Way higher." Clara watched from a nearby bench, hiding her smile behind her hand as Charles struggled to find the right rhythm. His usual confident demeanor had given way to endearing clumsiness. "Like this?" Charles pushed a bit stronger, and Ethan's delighted laugh rang out across the playground. "Higher, higher." As Charles finally found his groove, Clara couldn't contain her laughter anymore. The sound bubbled up from deep inside her, genuine, unrestrained joy she hadn't felt in years. The sight of Charles Whitmore, always so polished and proper, now red-faced and disheveled as he pushed their son on the swings, was something she never thought she'd see. After the swings, they stopped at a cheerful ice cream cart near the playground. Ethan chose chocolate chip, Clara picked vanilla, and Charles, after much deliberation, selected strawberry. They sat together on a park bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Thank you, Charles," Clara said softly, meeting his eyes. "For today." For all of this. Charles looked down at his ice cream cone, feeling something warm expand in his chest. It wasn't the pride he felt when closing a big deal or the satisfaction of buying something expensive. This was different, simpler, yet somehow more fulfilling than anything his wealth had ever brought him. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Ethan reached out and took both their hands in his small ones. His ice cream sticky. Fingers squeezed theirs as he looked up at them hopefully. "Can we always be together like this?" he asked. Charles felt his throat tighten at the innocent question. He remained silent, but something shifted inside him as he looked at his son's hopeful face and Clara's gentle expression in the fading light. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the shimmer of designer gowns. Clara stood beside Charles at the entrance, her heart pounding beneath her navy blue evening dress. Though she'd lost some weight in recent months, she still felt out of place among the stick-thin socialites who dominated these events. Charles placed a steady hand on her back as they made their way through the crowd. "Just stay close," he murmured, guiding her toward their assigned table. They hadn't made it halfway across the room when a familiar laugh cut through the ambient chatter. "Well, if it isn't Charles and his charitable project." Victoria Sterling, one of Charles's oldest friends, stood with her usual group of socialites. Her diamond necklace caught the light as she tilted her head mockingly. "Really, Charles," added Richard Montgomery, swirling his champagne. "We thought this little experiment of yours would have run its course by now. Surely you can't be serious about keeping up appearances with her." Clara felt her cheeks burn as several heads turned their way. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear from the judgmental stares and barely concealed smirks. "I mean, look at her," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's hardly the caliber of woman worthy of the Whitmore fortune. What would your mother say?" Charles had always laughed along with their cruel jokes before, and Clara braced herself for more humiliation. But something different happened instead. "That's enough." Charles's voice cut through the air like steel. The group fell silent, shocked by his tone. "Charles?" Victoria blinked, her perfect smile faltering. "I said that's enough." Charles stepped forward, his jaw set. "Clara is my wife, and she's the strongest woman I know." His voice carried across the now quiet ballroom. "She has more grace, dignity, and genuine kindness in her little finger than this entire room combined. And I won't stand here while you insult her." The silence stretched for a long moment before someone in the back began to clap. Like a wave, applause spread through the ballroom. Clara stood frozen, tears pricking at her eyes as she watched Charles's former friends shrink back, thoroughly chastened. Later, in the privacy of their limousine, Clara finally let the tears fall freely. They weren't tears of shame or hurt this time, but of pure joy. Charles reached across the leather seat and took her hand in his, not for show, not for any audience, but with genuine tenderness that made her heart swell. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm as the city lights blurred past their window, and in that quiet moment, something profound had shifted between them. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Clara prepared breakfast, humming softly while stirring pancake batter. Ethan sat at the counter, drawing with his crayons. When the doorbell rang insistently, a stack of newspapers hit the marble floor with a heavy thud as the housekeeper rushed in, her face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry," she stammered. Clara's world shattered as she read the bold headlines splashed across every major tabloid. "Millionaire Marries Maid as a joke." Below were transcripts of that fateful night, every cruel word captured in stark black and white. Photos showed Charles laughing with his friends, the bet laid out in excruciating detail. Her hands trembled as she read fragments of Charles's voice. "I'll marry her. Watch me. Easiest $50,000 I'll ever make." Ethan, curious about his mother's distress, picked up one of the papers. His 7-year-old eyes widened as he struggled to understand the words. Charles chose that moment to enter the kitchen, stopping dead in his tracks at the scene before him. "Was Mommy just a bet to you?" Ethan's voice quivered, tears welling in his innocent eyes. The crayon he'd been holding snapped in his small fist. Charles stepped forward, reaching out. "Ethan, I can explain." "Don't." Clara's voice cut through the air like ice. She lifted her chin, years of dignity holding her together even as her heart crumbled. "Ethan, go pack your backpack. We're leaving." While Ethan ran upstairs, Clara moved with quiet determination, gathering their essential belongings. Charles followed her, desperation in his voice. "Clara, please. That was before. Things are different. Now, different?" She whirled to face him, tears finally breaking free. "You made me a joke. You made our son a joke. All those nights I prayed for your heart to change. I was just entertainment for you and your wealthy friends." She methodically packed their bags, each item a reminder of the life she'd foolishly believed was becoming real. When Ethan returned, backpack clutched to his chest, Clara took his hand at the door. She turned one last time to the man she'd begun to love. "Love built on lies crumbles fast," she said coldly, her voice barely above a whisper. The door closed, with a quiet click, far more devastating than any slam could have been. Charles stood frozen, listening to their footsteps fade away, then slowly made his way back to the kitchen. There, on the counter, sat Clara's forgotten teacup, still half full and growing cold. A single lipstick mark on the rim caught the morning light. Charles sank into a chair, staring at this small piece of her left behind, the weight of everything he'd lost crushing down on him. The kitchen, usually warm with Clara's presence and Ethan's laughter, now echoed with an emptiness that felt infinite. Days stretched into an endless blur in the vast empty mansion. Charles wandered from room to room like a ghost, his footsteps echoing through spaces that once rang with Ethan's laughter and Clara's gentle humming. The silence was deafening. Each morning, he found himself staring at Clara's usual spot at the breakfast table, remembering how she'd pour Ethan's cereal while checking his homework one last time. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her coffee, but the warmth was gone. Charles tried calling again and again, sometimes hourly. Each time, the phone rang until it went to voicemail. "Clara, please," he'd whisper, his voice cracking. "Just let me explain." But there was never any response. On the fourth day, while passing Ethan's room, something caught his eye. A piece of paper had slipped partially under the bed, forgotten in their hasty departure. Charles's hands trembled as he picked it up. It was one of Ethan's drawings, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. "My family" was written across the top in wobbly letters. The tallest figure wore what looked like a tie, clearly meant to be Charles. Next to him stood a figure with long hair and a big heart drawn on her dress. Clara. Between them, a small figure with a huge smile, Ethan. Charles sank to the floor, clutching the drawing to his chest as tears began to fall. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He loved them. Not as part of some cruel joke or social experiment, but truly, deeply loved them. He loved Clara's quiet strength, her unwavering faith, the way she saw the best in everyone. He loved Ethan's infectious laugh, his innocent wisdom, the way he'd crawl into Charles's lap during movie nights. The weight of his cruelty, of what he'd destroyed, crushed him. For the first time since he was a child, Charles felt completely lost. He stumbled to his bedroom, the drawing still clutched in his hand. There, beside his king-sized bed, Charles did something he hadn't done in decades. He fell to his knees, hands clasped together like Clara had taught Ethan to do each night. "God," he whispered, his voice broken and raw, "I don't know if you're listening. I don't deserve to be heard. But please, please forgive me. Help me fix what I've broken. I'll do anything." His shoulders shook as he continued to pray, tears falling onto the drawing that showed the family he'd carelessly thrown away. Charles stood at the entrance of St. Mary's Soup Kitchen, his designer suit replaced by simple jeans and a plain button-down shirt. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The familiar smell of vegetable soup and fresh bread filled the air, but this time, he wasn't here as an observer. He was here to work. "Mr. Whitmore?" Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly volunteer coordinator, blinked in surprise. "Is everything all right?" "I'd like to help," he said quietly. "Really help this time. Not just write a check." The other volunteers whispered and stared as Charles rolled up his sleeves and grabbed a mop. He scrubbed floors until his back ached, served soup until his arms were tired, and washed dishes until his manicured hands were raw. Hour after hour, day after day, he returned. "Never thought I'd see the day," muttered one of the regular volunteers. "Charles Whitmore cleaning toilets?" But Charles kept coming back. He learned everyone's names, remembered their stories, and truly listened. The shield of arrogance he'd worn for so long began to crack and fall away. During a late-night meeting with his lawyers, Charles outlined his most ambitious project yet. "I want to establish a foundation," he explained, spreading the paperwork across his mahogany desk. "The Clara Johnson Foundation for Single Mothers." His legal team worked through the night, setting up a multi-million-dollar endowment. The foundation would provide housing assistance, job training, and legal aid to single mothers facing workplace discrimination. Charles insisted that every piece of literature bear Clara's name, not his own. Local news stations caught wind of Charles's transformation. Cameras captured him serving meals, mopping floors, and working alongside those he once looked down upon. But it wasn't for show anymore. The cameras often caught him when he didn't realize they were there. One evening, Clara sat in her small apartment, helping Ethan with his homework. The TV hummed quietly in the background until a familiar voice made her look up. Charles stood at a podium, his usual polished appearance replaced by something more genuine. "I spent my life thinking wealth meant worth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But true worth isn't in our bank accounts. It's in how we treat others. I learned that from someone who had every right to hate me, but chose to show me kindness instead." Clara's hands stilled on Ethan's textbook. She watched as Charles continued speaking about compassion and second chances, about the foundation bearing her name. Her eyes softened for a moment, though her expression remained guarded. She could see the change in him. It was there in his humbled posture, in the genuine tremor in his voice. But the wounds were still too fresh for easy forgiveness. The news segment ended, and Clara turned back to Ethan's homework, her heart a complicated mix of emotions. The man on the screen was different from the one who had made that cruel bet, but only time would tell if the change was real. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel sparkled with chandeliers and camera flashes as Charles Whitmore stepped up to the podium. His usual confident stride was replaced by something more humble, more human. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, business leaders, celebrities, and news cameras broadcasting live across the nation. Charles gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. The speech he'd prepared lay forgotten in his pocket. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras. "I stand before you tonight, not just as a businessman or philanthropist," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "but as a man who needs to confess something to the world." The crowd fell silent. In the back of the hall, Clara stood quietly with 7-year-old Ethan, her heart pounding. She hadn't planned to come, but Ethan had begged to see his father. "3 years ago," Charles continued, "I made the worst mistake of my life. I married an incredible woman, not for love, but because of a bet." Gasps rippled through the audience. "I was arrogant, cruel, and blind. I thought wealth and status were everything." I looked at Clara Johnson, this amazing, compassionate soul, and saw nothing but a chance to prove my own superiority. His voice cracked slightly. "But God has a way of turning our worst mistakes into our greatest blessings." Clara was never the bet. She was the miracle I almost threw away. Through her quiet strength and endless capacity for forgiveness, she taught me what true worth looks like. Through her son Ethan, she showed me what real love feels like. Tears glistened in Charles's eyes as he continued speaking. "I lost them both when the truth came out, and I deserved to lose them. But their absence taught me more than their presence ever could. It taught me that without love, all the money in the world means nothing." In the back of the hall, Clara felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Ethan squeezed her hand, his young face full of understanding beyond his years. "That's why I'm announcing tonight that the Whitmore Foundation will be dedicating $100 million to supporting single mothers and their children. Because every Clara out there deserves a chance to show the world her worth." Charles's voice grew softer, more personal. "Clara, if you're watching this, I know words aren't enough. But I am so deeply sorry. You deserved better than a bet. You deserved real love. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I fell completely in love with you and our son." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Around her, the crowd had risen to their feet, applauding through tears of their own. Ethan looked up at his mother, his small face serious and wise. "Mommy," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve, "he's different now." 3 days after Charles's public confession, he stood nervously on the front porch of Clara's modest 2-bedroom home. The peeling paint and creaky steps were a far cry from his mansion, but somehow this place felt more like home than anywhere else. Before he could knock, the door flew open. "Daddy!" Ethan burst out, wrapping his arms around Charles's waist with the pure, unconditional love that only children can give. Charles's eyes welled up as he hugged his son close, savoring the moment he'd feared might never come again. Clara appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress and an expression that mixed caution with something softer. Her eyes met Charles's, and after a long moment, she stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" she asked quietly. The house smelled of fresh baked bread and vegetable soup. In the small kitchen, 3 bowls were already set out on the worn wooden table. Charles's throat tightened. She'd been expecting him. "I made extra," Clara explained, ladling soup into the bowls. "It's nothing fancy, just vegetables from my garden." They sat down together, Ethan chattering happily about school while Charles and Clara listened. The simple meal tasted better than any 5-star restaurant Charles had ever visited. When Ethan finished eating, Clara sent him to do his homework. Left alone with her, Charles took a deep breath. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I won't make excuses for what I did. Nothing can justify it. But I want you to know that I'm committed to earning back your trust, one day at a time for as long as it takes." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that the man I've become is worthy of the love you and Ethan have given me." Clara listened silently, her hands folded in her lap. After what felt like an eternity, she lifted her eyes to his. The smallest smile touched her lips, just a glimmer, but it held more hope than Charles had dared to dream of. She nodded once, that tiny smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Charles sat between Clara and Ethan, his hand resting gently on Clara's as the congregation sang, "Amazing Grace." The familiar hymn held new meaning for him now, each word resonating with his own journey from darkness to light. Members of the church community smiled warmly at the family. Mrs. Anderson, who had known Clara for years from her volunteer work, reached across the pew to squeeze her hand. Mr. Peterson, one of Charles's former business associates, nodded respectfully at them both, no trace of the old mockery in his eyes. After the service ended, people gathered in small groups, chatting and sharing coffee. Several approached to welcome them, treating Clara not as Charles's former maid, but as his cherished wife. The transformation in how they viewed her was evident in their genuine smiles and sincere conversations. Ethan, who had been fidgeting during the sermon, suddenly turned to Charles. His small arms wrapped tightly around Charles's waist, face pressed against his father's suit jacket. "Mommy says you're my daddy," he whispered, his voice muffled but clear. "And now I believe it too." Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion, tears welling in his eyes. Unable to speak, he pulled both Clara and Ethan close, holding them as if they were the most precious treasures in the world. The three of them stood there, wrapped in an embrace that spoke volumes about their journey together. With tears still glistening in his eyes, Charles took Clara's hand in his right and Ethan's in his left. Together, they walked out of the church into the bright morning sunshine, stepping forward into their new life, one built on faith, love, and the power of redemption. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.